Welcome to IAS Project. We are continuing with the videos on Indian economy for UPSC Civil Services Exam. Let's talk about expenditure method. We have seen that in national income measurement, there are three methods. One is production method or output method, and income method and expenditure method. We have already talked about these two. Now let's talk about this. Expenditure method also has a concept of GDP. We can measure GDP in expenditure method by calculating expenditure or flow of incomes, because flow of income is balanced, so output is nothing but expenditure. In the early lectures, we have seen a relationship between individuals or households and firms. What was the relation? Individuals are giving firms with land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. For this, firms are giving return in terms of, for land they are giving rent, for labor they are giving income or wages, for capital interest, and for entrepreneurship they are giving profits. So now firms have manufactured certain goods and services. These firms are ultimately selling goods and services to people, that is individuals or households. And when households are purchasing these goods and services, they are paying back firms with their consumption expenditure. So from this we can see that whatever is the production is nothing but the same as expenditure, because whatever the goods and services individuals or households are buying from firms, and an equivalent value they are giving back to the firms in terms of consumption expenditure. Therefore, if we have calculated the value of goods and services and called it as GDP, this GDP will also be equal to the amount of consumption expenditure. So we can derive GDP using goods and services value or from consumption expenditure. If we derive GDP from consumption expenditure, it is called as expenditure method. We already know that income is nothing but consumption expenditure plus savings. This is nothing but disposable income. Consumption expenditure is by households and private, which is called as private final consumption expenditure, and it can also be by government final consumption expenditure. However, as we have noted before, corporations do not have any final expenditure, they only have savings. So in the entire economy, consumption expenditure comes only from private individuals, that is households, with that part of consumption expenditure is called as private final consumption expenditure, and also from government, and that part of expenditure is called as government final consumption expenditure. We know that whatever are the savings are there, they're ultimately used for investments in fixed assets as well as capital assets. Fixed assets can mean simply like buildings. Financial assets simply means giving out loans for which you will get back interest. So financial assets as well as fixed assets together are called as capital formation in an economy. So let's repeat this point once again because it is very important. Consumption expenditure only comes from two entities in an economy, that is from households as well as government. Whatever is the expenditure of households, it is called as private final consumption expenditure, PFCE. And whatever is the final consumption expenditure of government, it is called as GFCE, government final consumption expenditure. So this is about consumption expenditure. And about savings, savings are ultimately used for investments. And the investments can be in fixed assets like buildings, land, etc. or they can also be in financial assets. Whatever is the case, the total investments in fixed assets as well as financial assets is called as capital formation. So we can write this equation in a slightly different manner. Income is nothing but consumption expenditure, and in the place of savings, we are writing it as capital formation, because savings are ultimately being used for investments and investments are nothing but capital formation. Let's see how to calculate GDP in expenditure method. GDP is PFCE plus GFCE. Together they are called as consumption expenditure. We have GCF or gross capital formation, which is nothing but the investments or saving part. Also we have exports of goods and services, minus imports of goods and services, because we know that GDP is a territorial concept. For example, this is India. Whatever is happening within the territory of India, it has to be counted. Therefore, we also need to account for exports and imports of goods and services. Also, there is a term called as discrepancies, because when we measure GDP in production method and expenditure method, there are certain differences that are bound to arise. We will see why those certain differences arise shortly, but differences will come. To account for such differences, we add an entity which is called as discrepancies in GDP in expenditure method. In some books, this formula, that is GDP in expenditure method, is given by a formula like this. GDP is nothing but C plus I plus G plus X minus M. What does this mean? P is nothing but private final consumption expenditure. I stands for investments, which is nothing but gross capital formation. G stands for government final consumption expenditure. So G is nothing but GFCE. X stands for exports. M stands for imports. So depending on the book you read, you may find two kinds of formula, which are actually very equivalent. This is very simple to remember also. GDP is nothing but C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Sig X minus M. So C is nothing but consumption expenditure of households, which is called as private final consumption expenditure. I stands for investments, which is nothing but gross capital formation. Please remember this term, because in exams, especially in mains paper, you cannot write simply the word investments wherever you can write GCF. Writing GCF will give weight to your answers and weight to your sentences. So try to use gross capital formation wherever it is applicable. However, do not use it excessively or in places where it is not warranted. G stands for GFCE, that is government final consumption expenditure. So final consumption expenditure refers to amount of expenditure on consumption of goods and services. This can be of two types we have seen. It can be PFCE or it can be GFCE. Again, I am repeating this point. Corporations do not have any final consumption expenditure. They only have savings. Corporations do not incur any final consumption expenditure because whatever expenditure they incur, it is used in terms of intermediate consumption or for payments to employees. So corporations do not have any final consumption expenditure. They have only savings. Let's talk about private final consumption expenditure. Private final consumption expenditure is nothing but a final consumption expenditure that is incurred by individuals and households. Such expenditure can be by resident households within the economic territory or from the rest of the world. So therefore, we can write it in the terms of this equation. Non-resident households within the economic territory also have final consumption expenditure. Let's try to understand this again with the example of India and USA. This is India, this is USA. In India, we have residents of India. We also have some people who are non-residents of India. In USA and in other countries, we have residents of India who are working this, for example, software engineers and companies. All these three entities, that is residents of India, residents of India in outside world, that is rest of the world, as well as non-residents who are present in India. All these are having final consumption expenditure. So when we are calculating final consumption expenditure for Indian economy, we need to add this and we need to add this also, but we have to remove this. So let's see how it is done. Private final consumption expenditure is nothing but private final consumption expenditure in domestic market, that is by residents of India, plus final consumption expenditure of resident households in rest of the world, that is here. Not only in the case, not only USA, but also in Canada, but in Sri Lanka, in Nepal, Gulf, everywhere. Wherever the residents of India are there, they may be outside India. So this factor adds those. So final consumption expenditure of resident households in rest of the world. We also need to remove this term, final consumption expenditure of non-resident households within the economic territory of India. So to get private final consumption expenditure, we need to consider these three terms. Now let's talk about government final consumption expenditure. Final consumption expenditure by government as well as NPISHS. You know what NPISHS is. In SMA 2008, NPISHS is nothing but non-profit institutions serving households. So final consumption expenditure of these two sectors is called as general government final consumption expenditure. We have already talked about what general government is. Let's see once again. General government consists of central government, state government, and local government, and also social security funds controlled by these units. For example, we have seen pension funds. So general government includes central government, state government, local government, and funds like pension funds or social security funds, which are controlled by these governments. So consumption expenditure by general government is mainly for the benefit of community at large. For example, law and order, courts, disease control. For example, we have seen during the times of COVID-19 crisis, Delhi government was disinfecting the roads. So this is a disease control measure. This is nothing but final consumption expenditure of government. Also for defense purposes. So consumption expenditure can be this one, which is mainly for benefit of community at large, or it can be for the benefit of individual households also. For example, subsidized public distribution system, free COVID vaccines that were given during the COVID time to individuals or households, disaster relief payments. We have seen how floods are always happening in states like West Bengal and Assam. So whatever the disaster relief payments that are being given by state government as well as central government to those individuals and households, it also comes under government final consumption expenditure. Now let's talk about discrepancies. So we have seen that GDP in expenditure method can be written simply like this: C plus I plus G plus X minus M, and this GDP will be different from the GDP which is measured in production method, and the difference we have added it as discrepancies. So let's see what discrepancies are. There is often a small difference between GDP calculated by production method and expenditure method. The difference is because there is a time gap between production and consumption. And because of this time gap, what happens is, for example, if some goods and services are produced, their value is added directly in GDP. However, there may be a case that the produced goods and services are not consumed yet. So if they are not consumed yet, the expenditure is not made on those goods. So such kind of goods may not be calculated in GDP in expenditure method. So the goods and services which are already produced within the financial year are counted towards GDP production method, but if they are not consumed within that financial year, they are not calculated in the GDP of expenditure method. So there may be a difference. Also, there may be a change in the value of product between the time of production and time of consumption. We know that the market value of items keep changing. For example, onions, especially onions, at sometimes they go up to 100 rupees per kg, and at other times they fall down to 20 rupees a kg. So during the production process, when the value of onions is calculated, it may be something. But finally, when the expenditure is made by the households, that is when you go to the market and you buy, the cost may be something because time has lapsed between production and consumption. So this is also a difference which actually accounts for discrepancies. And the next point is that there may be loss or gain in the value or quantity during storage or transport of goods. The best example for this point can be Food Corporation of India. We know that Food Corporation of India buys food grains from the farmers and it stores the food grains for the purposes of strategic reserves. We know that much of the storage practices of Food Corporation of India are not very modern. So because of that, every year there is so much loss in food grains, especially because food grains are eaten away by rats and other rodents and animals, and also because of rains and all those, food grains get damaged. So during the production process, we have already measured what is the weight of all the food grains, and we have added the value of food grains to GDP in production method. However, now certain food grains are damaged and they cannot be used anymore. So when we measure the value of food grains in expenditure method, the quantity of food grains may be less because some are damaged. So this case shows that there is a difference in value of the food grains which are measured in production method and expenditure method. So all these three, that is time gap and change in value of product as well as loss or gain, all contribute to what is known as discrepancies. Let's follow up in the next video. Please like and share this video. Also subscribe to IAS Project. Thank you.